Yeah, let me introduce my co-author. This is Anneaktrin Puhle. I guess you're going to say something about your background, so I won't repeat it. She's a very gifted person and has also dared to work in this controversial area. It's not easy, but she has a multicultural background like myself. She's originally from Berlin, but is well versed in English literature as well as German literature. Okay, right, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Shakespeare and the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe were giants of poetry. Both have been quoted to death, they have been analyzed in detail, they have been compared with each other. But one little, very important detail has never really been discussed into detail, and which is really now forgotten, one can say. And that little detail is especially interesting for me, since I'm a philosopher and cultural anthropologist with a doctorate from Berlin. And I'm interested in this detail because it concerns the basic questions of mankind. The basic questions humans ever had, namely, what is death? What comes after death? And what might be reality? And is there maybe even a justice beyond death? Some fairness of life. And this detail I'm talking about are ghosts and spirits. And Goethe's and Shakespeare's works are populated with ghosts and spirits. So the belief in ghosts and spirits is as old as mankind, and as well the experience of ghosts and spirits, as far as we can trace back it in history. And that's why I was so interested in that topic in general, and I could work actually for a research institute in Germany for several years, the IGPP in Freiburg. And my task was to investigate the German literature first about ghosts and spirits in history as back as possible, up to our time. And then I did the equivalent project for an English research institute, and that is the Society for Psychical Research in London. And I found so many books, mainly monographs, about ghosts and spirits in the German language, about 2,000 in the beginning. And of course it grows all the time because you have so much modern literature as well. And I got an enormous amount of literature as well in the history for England. And you will find in this book here, our book, Shakespeare's Ghosts Life, a very extended bibliography, and you will get as well the libraries where you can find them. Since many of the books I was looking at you couldn't borrow, they were precious. Some books you only were allowed to touch with gloves. Other books you weren't allowed to copy, so I really had to travel actually to 30 libraries in Germany and in Austria to get access to these books. And we traveled together with Adrian, we traveled in England, mainly Cambridge and London. They have the biggest amount of these books. So we got several thousands of titles, and the question is, what shall we do with all these cases now? I found 10 categories which were suitable to fit the cases into, and these categories were concerning will and last will and testament cases. Sometimes the testament wasn't found, or the last will wasn't followed in the correct way. Cases would concern justice, they would concern warnings, hidden treasures, lost money. Some cases were giving advice, and in some cases the spirit appearance was connected to a miraculous curing. So there were other cases, they would concern callings, that the dead would come and tell the living, you have to come now to us. Then there were cases of prophecies or promises, and all these categories are still valid today, so you can find them all over history. In our time now, we have especially a terminology, we put things under the headlines crisis apparitions. That is when somebody has problems, is in stress, or is overworked, or is thinking about committing suicide. When people experience suddenly a ghost of a dead relative comes, or they sometimes see an angelic being, or they have contact with a religious figure, depending on their culture, which stops them actually then from doing it. Then you have cases when people come near to death, with near-death experiences. They are quite well investigated. Just recently a doctorate was done about that topic in University of North Texas. And this doctorate concerned 50,000 cases of people who have experienced some ghost after death, actually. So 50,000 people from 24 countries is quite a figure. But near-death experiences, of course, they concern ghosts, but the people come back, they don't actually die. Another category which is used today are these deathbed apparitions. When people actually die, they see spirits, they see angelic beings, they see beings of light. They have contact with religious figures. Some claim they have seen God. Often people greet somebody and say they have got a visit from some dead relative. And these cases are not only concerning the people who are dying, they concern as well people who are close to them. They can have an experience as well, but they wouldn't experience a godlike being or a ghost. They would experience the dying person. And often you can match that. You can say afterwards that was the same time. Some people look at the clock, they awake in the night, see suddenly somebody standing in the bedroom who couldn't really be there because he or she is far away. And then next morning they get the phone call that this person had died maybe exactly 3:05. Of course, this is a big problem because what is the point of death? Is there really a point of death? And you can't then say, was it maybe the last message the dying person has given? Or was it exactly at death? But what is the point of death? Medical people measure some point, but maybe it isn't really the point when people go. And then it was maybe a while after death. So we don't know exactly. But then there is this huge amount of this after-death communications, ADCs often called. And then you have these two very big categories of hauntings and poltergeists. The hauntings concern spirits or ghosts which are experienced over a long time period, often about over 10 decades or some even over hundreds of years. While poltergeist cases concern a short period. They occur over months only, and they are very current, very vivid, while hauntings are occurring sometimes only after many, many years. So to go to a haunted place and to hope you would catch a phenomenon is rather unlikely. While in poltergeist cases, when the researchers come, they often experience something, but typically that the poltergeist cases vanish when the researchers come. And these are so-called person-bound cases because they center around a person, often a young person, a person in puberty, and sometimes around a family with conflict. So when the conflicts are solved, then often the spook phenomena stop. So what is the fascination of ghosts and spirits? What is the fascination of the spirits and ghosts in Shakespeare? Even if people don't discuss it, that must be there. They must be aware that there is something greater in it, and it enlarges, in my opinion, the fascination is because we get a wider picture of the world. We integrate death, we integrate the ideas, what is after death, we integrate the dead people. And in the Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, there's even the whole world of nature spirits integrated. We go back to our childhood, we go in the magical years, we like it to be inspired in that way. And so the opposites are kind of integrated, life and death, fantasy and reality, this reality and maybe another reality, dream and reality. And this is what we try to say in our book. that we try to bridge these different areas, that they belong together, that dreams and the awake state belong together. And that's very interesting because the dream research now has shown that it's not either so or so. It's not either we are dreaming or we are awake. It is a gliding scale. We dream in different ways, in different states throughout the night, and we dream even during the day. When we think we are awake all the day, it's not true. We are very often slipping away, and we have only short moments of being fully awake. And what is very interesting in the dream research is lucidity. When people notice, suddenly they might see a dead person in the dream, suddenly think, that's strange, this person should be dead. And then they maybe get the kick and think, oh, I must be dreaming. And some people are skilled, and then they can stay in that dream. And then the fascination is when you can stay in the dream and realizing I'm dreaming, you can do things which you can't do in real life. You can fly, you can go through walls. That's a topic which the German-Swiss physician Paracelsus has already mentioned in the 1500s, that people have an astral body, a star body, with which you can go through walls. So you can test that in a lucid dream. And when Shakespeare suggests our world is a stage, our life is just a play, we are merely players, and we are made of a stuff which dreams are made of. When you start thinking, who is then the author? Who has made then these players? Who has created them? Who has produced that play we are in here in this life? And that's a very modern question, because you can then maybe speculate and think, are we maybe the authors, the creators of the world? Are we maybe even the creators of the figures in our dreams, of ourselves? Human mind, this state of dreaming and being awake, it's very difficult to accept that it's on a gliding scale. We like to sort things into right or left, into right or wrong, into black or white, into yes or no. So people want to say, that was a dream and that was reality. It's with either or. But it might be not so. And Puck in the Midsummer Night's Dream gives a very nice way out when he says, if ye shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. That you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. So I want to finish with this and give the word to Adrian Parker, my co-author. And Adrian is not only a professor of psychology in Sweden, University of Gothenburg, he has also got the first doctorate in parapsychology from the University of Edinburgh. And his research area is consciousness. And he will say more in detail now about Shakespeare, and his book, States of Mind, one can say, is a classic.
Anneaktrin, it's actually a privilege to work together, and constructive to work together with a philosopher. My background is in psychology, and I work at the University of Gothenburg, and I almost should thank them for their tolerance, because I'm quite obstinate in choosing subjects that are rather controversial. My main interests are things like hypnosis, dream research, and parapsychology. And universities don't really appreciate that kind of thing, but Gothenburg in Sweden has tolerated and encouraged me. In fact, I had state funding for a while to do research in these areas. I'm a psychologist, and I remember when I first began to study psychology, being told that if you're interested in human relationships, then you've come to the wrong department. You should go to literature and study Shakespeare. I'm glad to say that isn't really true nowadays. I think psychology has become much more of a living science. But I studied psychology, and I was also interested in medical sciences, and finally I became a clinical psychologist. So this isn't really my usual area of Shakespeare at all. I work sometimes clinically, but mainly doing research. But in looking at Shakespeare, I've been rather astounded, because actually there are many insights in Shakespeare that concern my research areas, especially dreams and the paranormal and psychic experiences. And it's a great enigma that nobody has lifted out these aspects. And so much has been written on Shakespeare, but as far as I know, there hasn't been really any discussion in depth about how he understood ghosts, or how the ghosts are represented in his plays, and what relevance this may have to modern-day thinking. I mean, after all, in one way, Shakespeare is, in many ways, in fact, Shakespeare is perhaps the wisest psychologist. And there are, I think, 6 plays with 14 ghosts. So it's not as though ghosts are just a sideline for Shakespeare. They're actually very central in many of his plays. Concerned with human connectiveness. There's this quite well-known quotation from, I think it's Sonnet 44, where he says, "If the dull substance of my flesh were thought, then injurious distance would not stop my way." So there's a kind of connectiveness of many of his thoughts there, too, I think, that are worthy of further discussion. So it's a kind of reclamation project in this book to try and bring together findings in psychology and research in controversial areas together with what can be culled from Shakespeare, and I think there's quite a lot there that can be brought out. I've called these, psychology's best kept secrets, because some of these secrets, well, we don't want to let out, because it gives the impression that psychology is not a science like other sciences, and psychology, like many sciences, admires physics, that everything should be replicable and measurable and so on. I would actually say psychic phenomena are established. I think there's as much evidence for the existence of psychic phenomena as there is for anything in psychology. It's the most checked out area in the whole of the research field, of major things anyway. So there can be little doubt that these phenomena exist. In fact, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Swedish film director Ingmar Bergman. He could go out quite straight and say it how it is. These phenomena exist. It's a fact. There's no discussion about it. That's the way it is. Scientists can't do that, but I certainly will say there's convincing, if not compelling, evidence that these phenomena exist. But they're rational. They don't make sense in our normal state of consciousness. They make sense in altered states of consciousness. They belong to altered states of consciousness. And this means that they're hard to get control over and produce in a laboratory like other phenomena. But they sometimes come with precise information. And this is actually also a thing in Shakespeare. Many of his ghosts actually give information. There's Richard III dreams, for instance. The dreams come, they torment Richard during his sleep. There are dreams, figures from all the persons in royalty that he's managed to execute or get rid of in some way in order to keep his position. And they torment him before this battle of Bosworth, which he loses. At the same time, they actually move over and to his opponent, Bolingbroke, and give him support. So these figures in the dream that Shakespeare represents are actually kind of independent. That's interesting. It's a topic I'm going to pick up on. And same is true of Brutus. He sees a ghost in a sort of sleep onset state when he's falling asleep. And again, this brings out altered states of consciousness. These phenomena, as I said, don't occur in the waking state, but they do give information. Psychic phenomena, the other best kept secret, psychic phenomena are not supernatural, they're not anomalous, they're not paranormal really, they are an indication of a fundamental connectiveness. They are a kind of confirmation that consciousness is important. It's an important aspect of the universe. It's not something that's irreducible. And physics, some interpretation of modern physics are moving closer to that. So in a way, it's not so controversial, but it's controversial for psychologists to bring this up, perhaps. But there is a tradition of researchers, I'm proud to say English researchers primarily at Cambridge. They founded the Society for Psychical Research. And this has been a source of interest of more open-minded academics, even from 1882 when it was first founded until today. It's still active, and there's still people like some of my colleagues, Rupert Sheldrake is an example, who are dedicated to this field. And if there's something to summarize from all this work that's gone on through the last 130 years or more, it's that there is a fundamental connectiveness. These phenomena are not sort of waves moving through the air. They are something to do with consciousness itself. Skeptics will, of course, reject this. But the interesting thing is that skeptics and extreme believers, they share common characteristics. That's intolerance for ambiguity. And if you study these phenomena, there's often ambiguity about them that you have to accept. And here I think Shakespeare again has something very worthy to say, a quotation from Hamlet. There are more things between heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Horatio was the skeptic in the whole thing. So I mentioned how in Richard III the ghosts appeared in two persons' dreams, independent of each other. And this is interesting. And what I'm trying to bring out here is that they do have this independence, which we can maybe call thought forms. There's another example of this. Julius Caesar, Brutus says, "Speak to me, evil spirit, what art thou?" And the answer is, "Thy evil spirit, Brutus." So that's showing that, first of all, that we actually create ghosts to some extent. Obviously, I don't believe that ghosts are physical things. They are creations of the mind, and they're very dependent on cultural interpretations. And this is certainly shown Shakespeare. Another example is the famous ghost in Hamlet. Obviously, it's dependent on cultural aspects. It's the ghost of his father telling Hamlet to avenge his murder is given temporary leave of absence from Hades. That was this cultural acceptance of ghosts, that they were only given temporary absence from Hades. They were either that or evil spirits. So these aspects do colour Shakespeare's presentation of ghosts, because if he presents the wrong way, he will lose his head, sort of thing. It was very sort of delicate how you dealt with the topic at that time. But there's an interesting aspect to this whole thing, the aspect that that when the ghost answers to Brutus, "Thy evil spirit, Brutus, I'm part of you." He's not just part of Brutus. He is able to predict the future, tell Brutus how he's going to die, the Battle of Philippi. And so he shows this independence. And this is there are other examples in Shakespeare of ghosts not just being pure creations of the mind, but having some independence. And this we call sometimes thought forms. And Puck itself, in the Midsummer Night's Dream, is a derivation from a Celtic Germanic form, puka, which is an independent thought form able to manifest itself to other people. I don't know if you know the film Harvey with James Stewart, and there's this rabbit that appears to James Stewart, the James Stewart character. And at first nobody else can see the rabbit, but in the end other people begin to see this 6-foot-tall rabbit, so it becomes contagious. This is a very good example of what is meant by a thought form. In fact, it is a puka, but there are examples of tulpas and jinns. They are in different cultures. So this is not just a limited cultural form. It occurs throughout many different cultures. And that is, again, a best-kept secret. The other thing that has come out of research, the fourth best-kept secret, is that these phenomena are not dangerous. People now often through religious aspects and through exploitation of mass media, are afraid of them. The horror stories, most haunted, or if from a religious point of view, works of the devil. And this is just a cultural interpretation of ghosts. If you actually look at the research literature, and I mentioned the Society for Psychical Research, collected many examples of poltergeist cases, which poltergeist may be an example, in fact, of these thought forms. Anyway, the major aspect from all of that research is that they're not harmful. I don't know of one case of poltergeist phenomena where anybody has been seriously hurt, despite the fact that large stones are thrown and fires are started. I don't know of a single well-attested case where anybody has seriously been injured or killed. So the way that ghosts and poltergeists are portrayed in the mass media is actually totally misleading. It doesn't correspond to the research literature. Perhaps the most well-known case at the moment that's got misrepresented in the film media is the Enfield case, the Enfield poltergeist case. Then finally we turn to the major question which Anneaktrin brought up, what these phenomena have for implications about the meaning of life and death. In fact, our book title, Shakespeare's Ghosts Live, is a play on words live and alive. I think Shakespeare's words and these phenomena have a relevance for today. They have a relevance for, as I mentioned earlier, indicating just how important consciousness is in the universe. This week in Sweden has been the Nobel Prize week, and I was reminded that at Gothenburg we actually do have a Nobel Prize winner. Arvid Carlsson got a Nobel Prize for his work on dopamine systems, important for understanding Parkinson's disease. He got it about 10 years ago, but he's still active, and he recently gave an interview. And he was asked about what happens when you die, because he's fairly elderly now and should thought about it, and he, to my great surprise, said that we perhaps experience something which doesn't have any aspect of time. Consciousness then enters a universe where there is no, where it's completely freed from the experience of time, and the brain ceases to exist. I was amazed because Arvid Carlsson has had a career as a materialist. He's a neuroscientist, and so his work has reduced the activity of the mind to biochemistry. But despite that, he is now has perhaps a wider view of the role of consciousness in the universe. And this is brought out in lucid dreams that Anneaktrin mentioned, just how consciousness can enter other alternative realities, perhaps, in lucid dreams. People often experience these dream worlds as being as real as the normal world. And again, Shakespeare has some relevance. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. In that sleep of death, what dreams may come. So Shakespeare really brings out the aspect that maybe reality is a consensus dream that we agree upon. Certainly consciousness creates the world. Even psychologists would go along with that now. The world is created actively from our sensory impressions, but primarily from our experience and memories. And perhaps you should also leave the last word to Shakespeare again. He says in one of his last plays, I think the last one he wrote by himself, we are such stuff as dreams are made of. So I think I'll leave it at that. And if you want to get it via internet, you can get it through our publishers, who are actually appropriately called Cambridge Scholars
Publishing.
Yes.
Cambridge Scholars Publishing. And you need this keyword then?
Yes.
And that price is valid until the end of the year.
Yeah, so you can also
Otherwise
get
it's sadly very high price.
Yeah, but here you don't have to
Get
pay
it
the
in
postage.
the shop. You get it as well under 20 here in the shop.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, questions?
How spiritual was Shakespeare? Did he have any religion?
Yeah, it's greatly discussed backwards and forwards if he was a Protestant or a Catholic. And he lived during the reign of Elizabeth, but also James II of England, and I think James IV of Scotland. He was a Scottish king who got the reign in England. And James was Catholic, whereas Elizabeth was, of course, Protestant. So he had to adjust the way he presented ghosts a little, as I mentioned earlier, according to who was in power at the time. So, I mean, it's undoubtedly coloured by culture. As for his own beliefs, we know very little about it. We know further back, I think his parents, I think his father, had some connection with Catholicism, but there's no indication that he was a Catholic. I think somewhere it's been found that he was registered as a Protestant in some letter or other, some document. So, but we really don't know much about his personal beliefs. We have to look at his works in order to understand that. We know very little about Shakespeare. In fact, there's that's the great enigma.
Spiritual things and religious, like the three witches.
Yes, that's right. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up.
That's quite spiritual, isn't it?
Yes, the witches, absolutely. That's a good representation of the occult beliefs of the time, and it was also a means of bringing in King James's experience, because the witches had, according to the belief at that time, they had done some kind of ritual or rite to divert the ship carrying James's bride, which was supposed to arrive in Edinburgh, had instead been, through a storm they had created, according to the witches, the rites that they'd carried out, they had created this storm to divert the ship, which ended up, it was coming from Copenhagen, ended up in Oslo. And James wasn't too pleased about this, obviously, and there was this great trial, as you may know, in North Berwick, and the witches were, I actually can't recall if they were burnt. Burning wasn't so common at that time. I think they were hung, in fact. But James had a great interest in the occult, and at first he was going to dismiss this as just delusion and superstition, until one of the witches whispered in his ear a secret, that is what his bride had told him, in intimate circumstances, and that was a rather foolish thing to do, because that convinced James immediately that they did have some psychic power, and that it was all this idea about them creating the storm might be true. So he didn't intervene, didn't stop them from being burnt or hung or whatever it was. So that episode of the witches is quite fascinating, but it's actually a representation to some extent of the same kind of witches that actually were in North Berwick. Many of the descriptions correspond. So in some sense it's a concession to James's experience, but it also brings out the idea of if you are dealing with ghosts or spirits, predicting the future is important, and these witches do predict the future. They produce Macbeth's downfall, and that will occur when the forest reaches this castle, and he thinks, well, that's very strange, that's not going to happen. And in fact, the Anglo-Scottish troops cut down branches from the trees and advance towards the castle with the protection of the trees. It comes true. So prophecy is a very important aspect of belief in ghosts and psychic phenomena at that time. And many of, as you may know, many of the ghosts in Shakespeare are prophetic. They tell what's going to happen. Richard III, Julius Caesar, they're full of the examples of ghosts that predict the future. there throughout many of Shakespeare's plays, and it's quite astounding that there are these aspects. I think that I try to bring out here that they demonstrate his belief in psychic phenomena. They demonstrate the connectedness of psychic phenomena as being aspect of consciousness and aspect of connectiveness between us all. And the importance of it all, and the fluidity between dream consciousness and waking consciousness, as brought out in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare. That's true, and that is perhaps the greatest play, the Tempest you're talking about. And this is a magician who has these powers again to bring storms about and to control the world to a large extent. And yet it's a great inner kind of dynamic that occurs. Eventually he forgives the people who wronged him. He is able to distance himself, create a harmony in himself. And that's, I think, also very much true of the beliefs of the time, that there were always conflicts, but we worked together. The belief was we worked together to create eventually a harmony within us. So you're asking why he burned his books. Well, I think he didn't want any retribution, he had lost his need for vengeance against the people who wronged him. He wanted to distance himself from all that. It's about, as I understand, the Tempest is about the development of the character maturing and getting beyond his ego. Because being a magician is very egoistic, really. Yeah. Manipulating people. I sometimes have done magic tricks for students, and it's fun, but in the end I actually was a bit uncertain about the ethics of it all. It's tricking people. Magic tricks. Not supposed to reveal, see? Not supposed to reveal them. There are various tricks. I can mention that many of the tricks aren't what they seem to be. Derren Brown, for instance, impresses people, but he often says it's done through hypnosis or subliminal perception. Makes psychologists sound very powerful, that you can manipulate people through quickly exposing something to their vision that they don't recognize and influence their decisions. But it doesn't work that way. Subliminal perception is not that strong, and often he uses hidden means of recording that he can find out what people have been doing, or he uses manipulation often, a double bluff. In other words, it's a bluff that is subliminal perception. It's really something else.
And he uses the magic of technology.
Technology, yes, primarily, yes, yeah. But my tricks are much simpler. I can tell you one simple thing I did. I would ask students to choose a card and to hold it up to everybody, and I'd say, I predict that the card that you hold it up. If you go to here and lift my mobile phone, you'll find the card that you predicted, and they're very impressed. But they don't realize that if it was another symbol that they'd chosen, I would say, go and open that book, you'll find the symbol there. I have all the symbols hidden somewhere in the room. It's usually fun to do.
So they were literally magic tricks rather than you actually...
Yes, they were literally magic tricks, yes.
Well, do you believe in
But
magic?
the interesting thing...
Real magic.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, if you ask that question to magicians, and there have been surveys of magicians, I mean professional illusionists, if you ask them, would you endorse a belief in the paranormal and telepathy? Between 80-85%. It's a closed circle. They're not doing it just to fool the public. They're giving, as far as we can judge, honest answers. 80-85% will answer yes, they do believe in ESP, telepathy, that kind of thing. So it's quite amazing.
Actual magic.
Yeah.
Things like about that.
No, I haven't heard about that. It evidently hasn't worked up to now. Well, or has it? I don't know.
It was worldwide.
Yeah.
They put binding
How
spells
interesting.
on it.
Yes. Okay. Has it worked? Do you know?
Well, it probably probably has, because it's one of the people, Lana, whatever her name is, she's a famous singer from LA, Lana Malibu, I forget her name. She was one of the main people.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what you thought about magic of the psychological kind, of the, you know, groups of people manifesting things in the real world through thought. I wonder.
That's quite fascinating. I mean, these thought forms can have their independence and can have their own life, as it were. I'm fascinated by it, but again, it's at the moment, I have to say, it's beyond science. They haven't, not because it's beyond scientific inquiry, but because science doesn't want to look at these things. It's too threatening to our worldview. But yeah, I think it deserves further consideration. You asked about magic, though. There's a kind of gliding scale between real magic, I mean manipulation, and occult magic, and perhaps these magicians who endorse their belief in the paranormal, they create a magical atmosphere in which miracles can occur, and they create a belief system. Temporarily, we suspend our critical thinking when we look at magic tricks. We're enthralled by them. And we go back almost to a childlike way of looking at things. And perhaps these are the very circumstances that will permit real paranormal phenomena to occur.
Real paranormal phenomenon, you know, my view is that there's not a lot of difference between somebody who's so-called schizophrenic or crazy, seeing things. The only difference is our reality is consensus. But for all intents and purposes, there's no way of proving that our reality is any more real than their reality, which sort of suggests that this thing called reality, as you were saying, was this type of construct. And, you know, it appears there's evidence that thought, and especially thought amongst a large group of people, can actually...
Yes, and it's a very controversial area, but if you look at it from a cultural perspective, different cultures, then schizophrenia or psychosis is pretty constant throughout different cultures. About 10% of the population would fall in that area, being schizophrenic, psychotic. But where they differ, where cultures differ, is how benign, malignant, as it were, the disease, so-called, is. In more pre-literate cultures, underdeveloped cultures, I don't think of a better word for this now, they're much more integrated, and it's a matter of a few weeks and then the episode is over, whereas in Western society you often have it for your whole life. So how the society reacts to it, how they interpret these experiences can influence the duration of them and how intense and serious they are. Ghosts could be one of three things. They did believe some people were absolutely crazy, but ghosts were works of the devil, or else then Catholicism did allow people out of Hades to carry out some message or to some purpose temporarily, but they had to go back again, like in the case of Hamlet. He was Hamlet's father was only allowed to give the message about how he'd been murdered. Then he had to go back to Hades.
The second question, you dismissed the idea of a malevolent aspect of this.
Yeah.
And but it seems that much of this is involved in, I'll just give you an example from my own life.
Yeah.
I can see ghosts, but only under conditions where I'm very, very tired, worn out, not in a good mental state.
Yeah.
Like maybe I haven't been sleeping well for a month or something because I'm doing some project. And it almost seems wrong, and I only seem to sense things that are bad.
Yeah.
If maybe you're being a bit premature in discounting an aspect of malevolence, especially since so much of the psychic phenomenon revolves around warnings and threats and stuff.
That's true. I'm not denying that there are negative events and people getting warnings of negative things happening, of airplane crashes or wars or whatever. but I'm mainly talking about poltergeist phenomena, so I think I would restrict it there. Do you have any?
I think there is a negative intent in it, and that they occur around people with problems normally. So there is certainly something which is a bit disturbed. And when you say you get these ghost pictures and so on when you are tired or stressed or
Very, very weak.
tired,
I was on tour and got hardly any sleep for a month. I might have slept like 3 hours a night for a whole month.
yes,
Ate very badly, maybe drank a bit too. And
it might relate then to your inner state very well.
Yeah, that you were more vulnerable.
Yeah. And I wanted to comment something to this idea if thoughts can have a magic effect on people, for instance. And there is this term, C.G. Jung used that, Carl Gustav Jung used that very much, coincidence. And I think lots of these phenomena occur, one could call by coincidence, because we don't know, we can't prove it. Is this really that somebody thought something and then it reaches somebody else? But we try to link them. So there is a lot of uncertainty in the whole area. So we don't often, it could be so or it could be so, and that is this teasing ambiguity. And some people are convinced, of course, they want it to work, they want to have that idea that it really works when you have negative or positive intention. But I don't think we can really say that is so. There's a lot what your own mind is doing with it, or how sensitive you are. Maybe you pick up something. We have that all the time. You say a strange word you have never heard, and then the same day somebody else says that word. And so you wonder, was it my thought which has reached the other person? Is he sensitive? Has he picked up? Or is it pure chance? Or is this a coincidence which makes sense for us? So it's still a great mystery around that. But I think your comment is very precious with negative intention, negative thoughts, and it's important to care for that. And even if it means you have to look into yourself, maybe people are so drawn into their own negative way of thinking that they get in a spiral and pull themselves more down and down. So that's a great danger, I think.
well, I mean, what I actually saw with ghosts, the ghosts weren't necessarily negative ghosts, but just the fact that when I'm in that state, which I never let myself get into, when I'm in that state, I do see ghosts, which is terrible.
Can I just say there was actually, if in that film there were several, but the most believable one.
Yeah.
There were several people present. There was Maurice Green, I think.
Morris Grove, yeah.
Morris Gross and Guy Playfair.
There was a WPC, there was a PC.
Yes, that's right. The newspaper reporter, yes. Yep.
And they all verify that they're actually Lego bricks were being thrown across the room.
Yeah.
And I think it was the cameraman was cut. So that was a definite example of malevolence producing a
I mean, there were Lego bricks being thrown all over the place, and people got sort of minor injuries, but I mean, sometimes there are huge rocks being thrown, fires being started, and yet I don't know of any example where anybody has been seriously injured, had to go to hospital, or been killed.
Maybe just so far.
So far. Well, these go back to the 1600s. We document in the Brook some examples of, we traced poltergeists from Shakespeare's time onwards.
We should actually say we have about 30 historical cases discussed in detail here in the book, fitting to the categories I mentioned. And then we have, thanks to Adrian's really effort, we really put in a lot of modern cases as well to show the link from old cases to current cases, and from poetry to real life, and to psychical research, from Shakespeare to psychical research. So we really wanted to show that.
And the interesting thing with many of these cases from the scientific point of view is that they do actually give information. So psychic phenomena are not just illusions. They do give factual information about where bodies are going to be found. We have such cases in the book. And in Shakespeare's plays, they do also give information, often prophetic information about where the person is going to die, like Richard III and die in the Battle of Bosworth. So that aspect, core aspect, themes exists throughout the literature, and it's there in Shakespeare as well. So I think there are a lot of insights in the works of Shakespeare that have relevance to modern psychology and our understanding of these phenomena.
back to your earlier question, there is a case I have integrated in the book, although it is a German case, but it was taken up by Catherine Crowe. She actually brought the word poltergeist from the German. Originally it was Martin Luther who used that word, at least I don't know an earlier source than Martin Luther. And she brought that term into the English language. It means just making noise. Poltern is making loud noises, throwing things around, objects and so on. And she has included as well a case which happened in 1800, beginning of the 1800s in Germany. That was a very sensitive young woman, and she came in the house of a physician. And that time it was usual that patients could stay for a longer period in the house of a physician, so she did. And she was bedridden, so she had never seen that place, that town where she was, had never looked around. She just came into the house of a physician. Justinus Kerner is his name. And she was called the Seeress of Prevorst. And this woman started seeing ghosts, and she was very uncomfortable with that. But she saw the ghost again and again. And it turned out a ghost with an information. And it was a particular ghost. And it was a man who was involved in a case which was judged by the court in the wrong way. So he wanted that this case should be taken up. And the interesting thing is there were lots of witnesses, and not only the physician, he involved finally authorities from the court. And they took all the details she said the ghost would have revealed to her. And she could say, go in this house, go in this room, go in this cupboard, go in this writing desk, open this box and look in a pile of paper at a paper which starts with a letter so-and-so, and there you will find indication how to solve that case. And they did. They followed her. And the case was opened up again and was corrected then. So there are such amazing cases where people see a bothersome ghost and don't want it really, but the ghost has apparently something to say. And it's very difficult then to say, of course people would say that was really a kind of appearance of that former person. And some people might go so far and say maybe it is a kind of telepathic knowledge of that dead person or of that wrongly decided case. So maybe a kind of memory of the place that she could step in and could even see that person. So the interpretation of such cases is still an open subject for science, as well with poltergeist cases. Some people nowadays, they relate it very much to your own mind, but of course there is as well a group of people who say that is a person who had been killed wrongly and the remains are there and the person tries to get attention and make people aware of something. So there are very many different interpretations, and it's difficult to say what's right and what's wrong. It might be different in every case.
Do you have conflicting views? Because I think you said when you were speaking that...
I think I would say that's very interesting, that interpretation, and I think it's absolutely valid. And I wouldn't dare to decide what is the right one. I'm still very open towards different possibilities.
What is quite fascinating in cases of group hallucinations or group sightings of ghosts, people can, from different angles, can see a ghost sometimes. They're not so common, but ghosts are not just solitary occasions. If there are several people in the room, they can perhaps collaborate each other. Whether it's due to some sort of group suggestion that they all agree on how the ghost looks or not, I don't know. But they're quite fascinating. The question is, what would have happened if you had a camera there? I don't know, because I haven't seen any ghosts recorded on camera that has convinced me. There's always been normal explanations.
It's interesting because one of the things that...
Marshall Chronic, for instance, this is the idea that everything which ever happened and will happen and is happening here on our planet is recorded somehow, and some people are sensitive and they kind of, in certain circumstances, they can step in and pick up some information, and that can be relevant for that too. When people see a ghost and the ghost reveals information which turns out to be right and useful for this life here, for this reality, that they as well step into that and then see a picture of a person involved in that case and get an information relevant for that case. So this idea is quite fascinating, that everything, it's like the Palm, what's it called, the Palm Library in German? It's called the same in English, I guess.
It is.
So that people think everything is somehow registered or exists anywhere, every idea.
But what I would like to emphasize is a lot of this is researchable. It just needs some ingenuity about how to do experiments. One of the most promising areas is that of lucid dreams, because I am not particularly skilled at lucid dreams, but I've had a few, and I can sympathize with the fact that some people can actually have conversations with these dream figures, even with deceased dream figures. And again, meaningful information is given, and for some people they are actually convinced that they have met the deceased person.
Real people. I did a
Now, that is
study just
researchable,
about
but,
that. Yeah,
yes,
I did
you've
a study
published on that,
actually with
yes.
90 cases, and the most dreamers were really convinced they had a serious, real conversation. And the interesting thing is that not only people often think the lucid dream experience is real as this reality, they sometimes think it is more real. And that I find very fascinating, because that relates to even to the physiology, which would say you can measure in lucid dreams the typical waves for being awake, the beta waves, but you can as well measure the typical waves for a state of meditation. That means you have maybe a higher awareness even than we have normally here.
You have a question.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you-
you were...
Can we make this the last question?
Yes.
On reactions from those members of the public.
Last
So
Okay.
it might be very fun, it looks like a joke or something.
Yeah. Well,
When it starts, it gets quite serious. It's quite impressive.
okay.
So it was
well,
not a question, it's just
Yeah,
maybe
well,
something
fine.
you might be interested
Yeah,
in.
sure. Thank you for that. Yeah.
So that was the last question.
Yes,
Now we have
okay.
to stop now.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to
Okay.
Catherine and Adrian.
Thank you.